Della Renfrow walked out of the Cordell Stockyard on the day they took everything, and she did not run. She had every reason to run. Behind her, 40 cattlemen stood along the pen rails and watched. Her father's 300 head milled in another man's chute, wearing another man's iron, burned over her own family's brand while the metal was still warm. And Royce Coburn, the man who'd ridden out to court her all that spring, reached past her and latched the loading gate her own father had forged by hand. He latched it slow, so she'd hear it. His father read the seizure note out loud so the whole yard could hear that too. Then, Royce said the thing men in 3 counties would repeat for years. He said, "A Renfrow ships nothing through Cordell as long as I hold the ground." She held her father's tally ledger against her chest. She did not cry at the gate. She turned, and she walked the long way, the whole length of that yard, past every face that had eaten at her father's table, down to the freight office at the far end. And at the window, she asked the clerk 2 things: the lowest, dirtiest job the company had, and the price of 1 share. I'll tell you what she did with that share. But not yet. If anyone ever told you you'd be nothing without them, this story is for you. Before I go on, do this for me. Subscribe so you don't lose the rest of it, and comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story rides, then come back, because we're starting where it started. On the land. Ezra Renfrow broke 40 acres of the hardest ground in Kansas with a mule and his own 2 hands, and he did it before the railhead ever came to Cordell Crossing. That's a thing worth understanding first. There was no town there when he started. There was grass and wind and a creek that ran thin in August and a horizon so flat and so wide that a man felt watched by God every hour of the day. Ezra came out in the spring of a year nobody wrote down, and he sank his plow into ground that had never been turned. It broke 2 blades that first season. It broke something in his back that never sat right again. But he turned it. He patented the strip with the land office, clean and legal. 40 acres in the Renfrow name, and he leaned a house against the wind and he stayed. Then, the railroad came. It always comes. The Cordell Cattle and Rail Company laid its track, and it built its shipping pens right at the edge of the grass, where the drovers could bring their herds up from the south and load them onto the cars. And here is the thing you want to hold on to. When they laid out those pens, the surveyors ran them right up onto the edge of Ezra Renfrow's 40. Part of the loading yard, the near pens, the first chutes, stood on ground that belonged to Ezra. It was on his patent. It was in his name. Cordell Cattle and Rail paid him $1 a season to lease it. $1. Ezra took the dollar because $1 was $1, and because he was not a man to make a fuss over what seemed small. He figured the railhead was good for everybody. More buyers, better prices, a town where there'd been nothing. He was mostly right about that. Cordell Crossing grew up out of the dust, a mercantile, a bank, a church with a real bell, 2 saloons, a freight depot, all of it feeding off the cattle that came through those pens every fall. And Della grew up in the middle of it. She was a cattleman's daughter down to the bone. Before she could read a book, she could read a herd. Her father would set her on the top rail of the working pen while the hands cut and sorted, and he'd say, "Count them, girl." And she'd count. Not one by one, the way a child does. She learned to count them in a flow, the way water counts itself going over a falls, a whole moving mass of horn and hide passing through a gate, and the number just landing in her head, clean and sure. By the time she was 12, she could tally a herd through a chute faster than any grown man on the place, and she was never wrong. Her father used to bet on it. He'd have a buyer count his own way, slow and careful with a string of beads, and he'd have Della do it by eye, and the numbers would match, and Ezra would grin like he'd invented her. She loved that grin more than anything in the world. They were not rich. Understand that. A man who breaks 40 acres of dry ground does not get rich. But they were decent. and they were steady, and Ezra Renfrow's word was worth more at the Cordell Bank than his balance ever was. He paid what he owed. He said what he meant. When a neighbor's barn burned, he was there before the ashes cooled. And when a drought year came, he'd carry a struggling family on a handshake and never once bring it up again. That was the man. That was the daughter he raised. Plain and honest and good at a hard thing, and content, for a while to want nothing more than to keep the small foothold her father had cut out of the prairie with his own back. You need to love her here. Because they took all of it. Now let me plant something for you, and I want you to half forget it the way she did. It was supper. An ordinary supper, cornbread and beans and coffee gone bitter on the stove, wind pushing at the shutters. Della was maybe 16. Her father was talking the way he did, half to her and half to the fire, and he waved his spoon out toward the dark where the pens sat. And he said something she'd remember later so hard it would ache. He said, "Half those pens stand on our 40. Girl," she said, "I know. Pa." And he laughed, a dry little laugh with no bottom to it. Coburn pays us $1 and laughs about it in town. $1 a season for the ground his whole railhead leans on. He shook his head. Never signed it clear, though, the lease. It's a handshake and a paper that don't say half what he thinks it says. He pointed the spoon at her like it mattered, though his voice made it sound like it didn't. A man ought to read what he leans on, Della, remember that. A man ought always read what he's standing on. She said she would. Then he asked her to pass the cornbread, and they talked about the roan mare's bad foot, and she did not think about the pens again for years. Hold that. Set it down somewhere in the back of your mind and let it get dusty. She did. Now let me tell you how they came apart. It came in 3 blows, and each one was worse than the last, and the first one she didn't even see. The first blow was a lie told in numbers, and it happened at the weigh-in. It was fall shipping. Ezra brought his herd up to the Cordell pens the way he did every year, 300 head, good stock, wintered well, and fattened on the summer grass. Della rode with him. She always rode with him. And she sat the rail while the Coburn clerk stood at the chute with his book and his pencil and counted the Renfrow cattle through, one gate at a time, marking the tally that would set what Ezra got paid. Della counted too. Out of habit. Out of love of the thing. She counted them through the way she'd counted since she was a girl, the number flowing up clean in her head, and when the last steer's tail cleared the gate her number was 300. Near enough. 298 sound, and she knew which 2 were shy. The clerk closed his book. He wrote down 244. 244. 56 head. Gone. Not lost. Not strayed. Gone off the paper, between her eyes and his pencil. She opened her mouth to say it. She was already saying it. Pa, that's wrong. That's not the count. But the yard was loud, and her father was talking to a buyer, and the clerk had already moved off toward the office with the book under his arm, and by the time the number got to Ezra, it was written and signed, and it was the company's word against a girl's eye. There was one other man who saw it. Down the rail, an old freight clerk named Amos Teague had been standing with his own book open, marking cars, and Amos had a habit older than the company itself. He counted everything, because numbers were the one honest thing left in the world as far as he was concerned. Amos counted the Renfrow herd through that chute the same as Della did, and Amos got the same number she did, and Amos watched the Coburn clerk write down 244, and Amos said nothing. He said nothing because he was 60 years old, and he had a room over the depot and a bad hip and no other place in the world, and a man who worked for Cordell Cattle and Rail learned early what happened to men who corrected the Coburn's arithmetic. But he wrote the true count in his own book. 298. He wrote it small, in the corner, and he underlined it, and he did not know why. he'd find out. 10 years later, he'd find out exactly why. That's the first blow. A rigged short count, 56 heads stolen with a pencil, and only 2 people in Kansas knew it happened, and both of them held their tongues. Keep that true number. It's going to come back, and it's going to cost a man everything. The second blow was bigger, and it came with a witness, and it wore the face of the law instead of a lie. It was a hard winter that year. The worst in memory. The kind of winter that comes down off the plains like a judgment, weeks of it, snow to the fence tops and cattle drifting to die in the draws. Every ranch on the flat took losses. Ezra took his share, and more. By spring he'd buried a third of what he'd wintered, and he was short on cash, short on feed, short the way an honest man gets short when the weather decides against him, through no fault he could have prevented. He had a note at the Cordell Bank. Everyone did. You borrowed against the fall to get through to the spring. That was ranching. Ezra's note was $3,400, and it ran on terms he'd made in good faith with men he'd trusted for 15 years. It was not due. Not for the better part of a year. Thornton Coburn called it anyway. Now, Thornton Coburn owned the Cordell Cattle and Rail Company, and Thornton Coburn also sat on the board of the Cordell Bank. Because that is how it works in a town a company builds, the man who owns the railhead owns the ground under the money too. And Thornton Coburn had wanted the Renfrow 40 for a long time. Not because it was much. Because his pen stood on it, and he did not like leaning on another man's ground, and he especially did not like paying $1 a season and knowing, somewhere in the back of his hard bright mind, that the paper under his own railhead wasn't his. So he called the note. $3,400. Due in 60 days. 60 days. After that winter, there was not a rancher in the county who could have made it, and Ezra Renfrow, gutted by the snow, could no more raise $3,400 in 60 days than he could raise the dead cattle out of the draws. Coburn brought the paper out to the ranch himself, because he was that kind of man. He liked to hand a thing to you personally, and he brought the rail agent along, a company man named Pell, ostensibly to witness the terms. So there'd be a second man to swear it was all legal and clean. Della was there. She stood in the door of the house her father had leaned against the wind, and she heard Thornton Coburn tell Ezra Renfrow, in a voice as flat and reasonable as a ledger line, that the note was due, that 60 days was the term, and that after that, the company would have no choice but to secure what it was owed. And behind Coburn, out on the road, on a good horse, sat Royce. Royce Coburn had been riding out to the Renfrow place all spring. That's the part that turns the knife. He'd been courting Della, properly, or what passed for properly. Hat in hand, and a bunch of prairie flowers once that he'd clearly cut from the ditch outside town, but that she'd put in a jar of water all the same. He was handsome, in the easy way of a man who'd never been told no. He made her laugh. He told her the two of them were nothing like their fathers, that a new country was coming, that the old grudges were going to blow away like chaff. She half believed him. She was 20, and he was warm, and the future looked like something you could actually reach out and hold. That day, with the note in her father's hand and Pell watching, and old Coburn's flat voice still hanging in the air, Royce found her at the corner of the house and took both her hands in his and swore to her, low so the others couldn't hear, that he would fix it, that his father listened to him, that he'd speak to him that very night, and this would all come right, and she was not to worry. He gave her his word. He looked her dead in the eye and gave it to her like a gift. Hold on to that too. His word. It's the cheapest thing in this whole story, and she's about to find out exactly what it's worth. 60 days went by. Royce did not come. Not the 4th week, not the 6th, not the 8th. She sent word once and got nothing back. And on the day the note came due, and the day after that, and the day after that, there was only silence out of the Coburn house, the loud, specific silence of a man who has already made his choice and is simply waiting for the calendar to make it for him. Which brings us to the third blow. The public one. The one 40 men watched. It was shipping season again, the biggest day of the Cordell year. The whole county's cattle came up to the pens in those weeks, herd after herd, and the yard ran from dark to dark, full of dust and bawling, and the clang of gates, and the long strings of cars waiting on the siding. Every cattleman for 40 miles was there, or came through. Buyers from Kansas City in town suits. The rail agent Pell and Thornton Coburn walking the rails like a general, because this was his season and his ground and his triumph, every fall. Ezra had brought his herd up. He didn't have a choice. He had to ship to have any hope of touching that note, even late, even short. 300 head, or what the winter had left him of them, up the trail and into the holding pens, and Della rode dragged the whole way with dust in her teeth, and her father quiet ahead of her on the wagon seat, and neither of them said what they both knew, which was that they were driving those cattle straight into a trap that had already closed. Coburn was waiting. He let them get the herd into the pens first. That was deliberate. He let Ezra's cattle fill the Cordell chutes, the near ones, the ones on the Renfrow 40, so that the herd was inside the company's fences and the gates were shut before anything was said. And then, with the yard full of men and the buyers watching and the whole shipping season stopped to see it, Thornton Coburn climbed up on the loading platform with a paper in his hand, and he read the seizure aloud. He read it out in that flat bank voice. The note. The default. The amount, $3,400, unpaid past its term. The company's lawful right to secure its debt against the property pledged, and the property pledged, by the fine print of a paper Ezra had signed trusting the men across the table, was the herd itself and the stock and, worst of all, the improvements on the leased ground. Coburn read it all. And when he finished, he nodded to his clerk. And the Coburn hands went down the line, and they drove Ezra Renfrow's 300 head from the near pens into the company's holding pens, and at the far end of that run stood a man with a heated iron and a fire, and one by one, in front of 40 cattlemen, they burned the Cordell brand over the Renfrow brand on every steer. You could smell it. Burned hair and hide, all across the yard. That's the smell she'd remember. Her father's cattle, her father's whole year, her father's brand blotted out under Coburn's iron, while 40 men who'd shaken Ezra Renfrow's honest hand stood along the rails and said nothing. Some of them looked at their boots. That was the most any of them did. They looked at their boots. Ezra didn't fight. There was nothing to fight with. The law was the paper, and the paper was Coburn's, and Coburn owned the men who'd have enforced any other paper. Her father stood in the middle of that yard and got about 10 years older in 10 minutes, and he did not say one word, and that silence was worse than any shouting could have been. And then Della saw Royce. He was up on the platform by his father. Clean. He'd been there the whole time. He hadn't spoken to his father the way he'd sworn, or if he had it was to say drive them in. He didn't meet her eyes at first. He looked out over the herd, over the crowd, anywhere but at the girl he'd brought ditch flowers to a month before. And she walked toward him, not to beg. She'd tell you later she didn't know herself what she meant to do, only that she had to look at him. She had to make him look at her and say it. She got up onto the loading platform, and she stood in front of him with the whole yard watching, and there was one gate between them, the near chute gate, the good iron gate her own father had forged with his own hands and hung on that chute, back when the company first built the pens on his ground, because Ezra was a fair hand at a forge, and the company had asked, and he'd done it cheap. The way he did everything, glad to be useful. Royce put his hand on that gate, and he swung it shut between them, and he dropped the latch, slow, so she'd hear it, her father's own iron latched in her face by the man who'd sworn to save her, and then, so the yard could hear it. Because his father was watching, and there is a kind of son who will do anything to be admired by a father like that. Royce Coburn said the line. A Renfrow ships nothing through Cordell as long as I hold the ground. There it was. The whole yard heard it. Somewhere a steer bawled and a car door rolled, and the words just hung there in the cattle dust and the brand smoke, and 40 men heard a boy tell a ruined girl that she and hers were finished in this country as long as a Coburn stood on the land. She did not cry. I want you to understand what that cost her, because it's the hinge of everything that comes after. Every nerve in her body wanted to break right there, in front of all of them, and give them the thing they were half waiting for, the tears, the collapse, the proof that a Renfrow was nothing. She felt it come up in her like water up a well, and she reached down somewhere, and she shut the valve. She took her father's tally ledger, which she'd carried up onto that platform without even knowing why, and she held it flat against her chest with both arms like it was the only warm thing left in Kansas. And she turned her back on Royce Coburn and his gate and his father and his line. And she walked. She walked the length of that yard, the whole length, past the burning pens and the branding fire, past the buyers in their town suits, past every cattleman along every rail, past the ones who looked at their boots and the 2 or 3 who had the decency to take their hats off, which somehow was worse. She walked slow. She would not give them one quick step, and she went all the way down to the far end of the yard, where the freight office sat with its little dusty window, as far from the platform as a person could get, and still be in the Cordell Stockyard at all. And at that window, she found the old clerk. Amos Teague. The man who'd written 298 in the corner of his book and underlined it and told no one. She was shaking. She hid it. She set her father's ledger down on the sill, and she looked at that old man through the glass, and she asked him for 2 things, and her voice came out level, which surprised them both. She asked, "What's the lowest job this company's got?" "The worst one. The one nobody'll take." Amos blinked at her. He'd expected weeping. He'd braced for it. This he had no shelf for. "Girl," he said, "you don't want. I do." Steady, flat as her father's voice reading a brand. "The lowest, dirtiest job the Cordell Company has. Whatever it pays. I'll take it tomorrow." He told her, loading freight and mucking the stock cars, 10, 12 hours, wages that were barely wages, work that broke men twice her size. She nodded like he'd told her the weather. Then she asked the second thing, and this is the one old Amos would lie awake turning over for the next 10 years. She asked, "And what's the price of one share?" He didn't follow. "Share of what?" "The yard." She nodded back up the length of the stockyard, up toward the platform where they were still burning her father's brand off her father's cattle. "This, the cooperative. It's held in shares. I've heard my pa say it. What does one share cost?" Amos Teague stood there behind his dusty glass and looked at a 20-year-old girl who had just been ruined in front of the whole county and had not shed one tear, and who was asking him, while the smoke of it was still in the air, the price of buying one small piece of the thing that had destroyed her. And something moved in that old man that hadn't moved in years. He told her the price. It was more than she had. It was more than she'd make in a season of mucking cars. Far more. She nodded. "All right," she said. Like it was settled. Like she'd just been quoted the price of flour. "All right." She picked up her father's ledger off the sill, and she held it back against her chest, and she walked out of the Cordell Stockyard on her own 2 feet. And she did not run. Her father did not last the year. I wish I could tell you Ezra Renfrow found some fight in him after that day. Some ember to warm his hands at. He didn't. Something in a man breaks when he watches his life's work driven off under another man's iron, and Ezra's break was the quiet kind that doesn't heal. He went home to the house he'd leaned against the wind, and he got smaller in it, week by week. He stopped talking about the roan mare and the fence line and the price of beef. He'd sit on the step in the evening and look out at the pens on the far edge of his 40. His 40. Still, the ground the company hadn't managed to take, only everything that fed off it, and he'd say nothing at all. By the next fall, he was gone. The doctor wrote down a word for it, but Della knew the real word. He died of being right about people who turned out not to matter, and being wrong about people who did. He left her almost nothing: a house going gray, some tools, the roan mare, and two things she kept closer than her own heartbeat. The first was his tally ledger, the book she'd carried out of the yard, every count her father had ever made, in his square, careful hand, going back before she was born. A whole honest life written in cattle and dates and small sums that always added up. She kept it wrapped in oilcloth, and the second, she almost didn't find it. It was folded flat in the back of the family Bible, soft at the creases from age. The land patent. The original grant. 40 acres, in the Renfrow name, signed and sealed by the land office in a year nobody wrote down. Free and clear, and never sold, never signed away, only leased for $1 a season on a handshake and a paper that, her father had said once at supper with a spoon in his hand, didn't say half what Coburn thought it said. She held that folded patent in her hands the night after they buried him. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in a place gone dusty for 4 years, an old voice said, "A man ought to read what he leans on." Girl, she read it. She sat up all that night by a low lamp, and she read every word on that patent, and then she read the town's copy of the lease when she could get her hands on it, and she read the note her father had signed, and the seizure paper. All of it. The way her father had never quite gotten around to doing because he was too busy being honest to imagine anyone else wasn't. And she began, slowly, over a great many nights, to understand exactly what her father had leaned on. And exactly what Thornton Coburn had leaned on. And that they were not the same thing at all. It took her 10 years. I'm going to say that again, because I want it to land the way it landed on her, standing at that freight window with her father's ledger against her chest and the smoke still in the air. It took her 10 years. And she counted every one of them. She started the very next morning at the bottom. She took the lowest, dirtiest job the Cordell Cattle and Rail Company had, exactly as she'd asked, and she mucked stock cars and heaved freight in the heat and the cold for wages that were barely wages, and she did it under the eye of the same company that had burned her name off her father's cattle. She slept in the freight loft above the depot, in a corner Amos let her have, on a pallet that smelled of grain and axle grease. And every night, dead on her feet, she'd climb up to that loft and light a stub of candle and open 2 books. Her father's ledger on the left. And a rate book. The company's freight rates, the shipping schedules, the tables of what it cost to move a head of cattle from Cordell to Kansas City, and what the drovers paid, and where every dollar went, and who kept it. She learned the company from the inside of its own numbers. And Amos Teague, who had underlined a true count in the corner of a book 10 years before, and never known why, Amos started teaching her. Quietly, at first just answering the questions she brought up to the window. Then more. How a share worked. How the cooperative that held the yard was really governed, and by how few men, and how loosely. How a rate got set. Where the paper lived, and who actually read it, which was almost nobody, because the men who owned Cordell were too rich and too sure to read what they leaned on. She bought her first share within the year. She did it by not eating some weeks, and by wearing the same 2 dresses until they were more patch than cloth, and by taking every extra shift and every filthy job the yard threw off. And when she had the money, the exact money Amos had quoted her at that window on the worst day of her life, she bought 1 share of the Cordell Yard Cooperative, in a name that wasn't quite Renfrow, because Amos suggested, gentle, that a Renfrow buying in might draw the wrong eye. So she bought it under the name she was building for herself, plain and forgettable, a freight hand nobody looked at twice. 1 share. Out of hundreds. It changed nothing anyone could see. Thornton Coburn owned the railhead, and his son owned the future, and the girl they'd walked out of the yard was mucking cars in the dark. And if either Coburn thought of her at all, they thought of her the way you think of a fence you've already torn down. Done, behind you. Beneath notice. That was the first step. And the beauty of it, the thing that would ruin them, was exactly that no one saw it as a step at all. She did not stop at freight for long. She was too good with numbers and too quiet and too patient, and within a couple of years she'd worked her way off the loading dock and into the freight books themselves, keeping accounts, then routing shipments, then, carefully, in that borrowed plain name, taking on a little freight business of her own on the side. A small thing. Routing a few drovers' herds around the edges of the Coburn fees, finding them a rate the company didn't offer, saving them $1 a head here and there. Word got around, the way it does, among men who ship cattle for a living and count every dollar. There was a freight hand out of Cordell who'd give you an honest count and a fair rate, and never once put a thumb on the scale. An honest count. In that country, after what everyone had watched happen to Ezra Renfrow, an honest count was worth more than gold. Men started asking for her by that plain name without ever once connecting it to the girl who'd walked the length of the yard. And then she hit her first wall, and I'll not pretend she didn't, because the 10 years were not a straight climb, and anyone who tells you their 10 years were is lying to you. She landed a real contract, her first true one. A syndicate of small ranchers, tired of the Coburn squeeze, agreeing to route a whole season's herds through her little freight operation instead of straight through the company's fees. It was everything she'd worked toward. It was the year that was going to turn a freight hand into something more. Thornton Coburn broke it in a week. He didn't even know it was her. That's the part to sit with. He never knew. He simply saw a small freight operator eating at the edge of his rates, the way a big cattle company sees a fly, and he did the thing big companies do. He undercut her. He dropped his rates below any price she could match, and he let the ranchers come running back to him. And then, once she was starved out of the season, he quietly let his rates drift back up where they'd been. It cost her everything she'd saved and most of what she'd borrowed. She lost the whole season. She was, that winter, nearly back where she'd started, mucking numbers by candlelight, a share of paper her only wealth, watching her breath in the cold of the freight loft. She did not quit. She sat in that loft, with her father's ledger open on her knees, and she did the sum on what Coburn had just done. How much money he'd burned to swat her. How much a man like that could afford to burn, and for how long. And instead of despair, she felt something cold and clear settle into her, because the sum told her something. It told her Coburn's power wasn't the rates. He could always cut a rate. His power was the ground. The pens, the chutes, the one place in 40 miles a rancher could load a herd onto a train. As long as he held that, he could bleed any competitor dry whenever he chose. So she stopped trying to beat him on rates, and she started, very quietly, with almost no money and a great deal of patience, to go after the ground. She began with her own, the Renfrow 40, because here was the thing her father hadn't lived to use, the thing folded soft in the back of the Bible. The company had taken the herd and the stock and the improvements, but it had never taken the land. It couldn't. The patent was clean. The lease was only a lease, and after Ezra died, the 40 had drifted into arrears at the county for unpaid back taxes, and the county, in time, put it up. 40 acres of what looked, to anyone glancing at a map, like worthless dry dirt. Dirt that happened to have another man's loading pens sitting on it. Della bought it back for the back taxes. A handful of dollars, in the plain name she'd built. And when the sale crossed Thornton Coburn's desk, because it did, the near pens sat on it, and his clerk brought it to his attention, Coburn looked at 40 acres of scrub under his own railhead, ground he already paid a token dollar a season to lease, and never thought about twice, and he waved it off. Let some freight clerk waste money on dirt. It changed nothing. His pens were his pens. His lease ran on. Why would he care who technically held the scrub underneath, as long as the $1-a-season paper still stood? Because he never read what he leaned on. That's why. The night that deed came through, Della climbed to her loft and lit her candle, and for the first time in the 10 years, she opened a second book beside her father's, her own tally book. Clean pages, her own square hand learned from his, and on the first line she did not write cattle. She wrote the 40 acres. The Renfrow ground, back in the Renfrow blood, bought out from under the very pens that had ruined them, and not one Coburn alive with the sense to notice. She sat there a long while with the two ledgers open side by side in the candlelight, her father's, full, honest, closed, hers, open, and empty but for one line, and that one line was the ground the whole Coburn empire stood on. She turned the page, and she started to write the rest. The rest took shape one clean line at a time. She did not hurry it. 10 years had taught her that hurry was Coburn's habit, not hers. A man in a hurry signs papers he has not read. A man in a hurry calls a note early because the winter was hard and he smells a chance. Della had watched that hurry take everything her father built, and she had decided, in the freight loft with the candle low, that she would never own a thing she did not understand down to the last word on the back of the page. So she read. Everything. The lease under the pens. The right-of-way that let the rail spur across the ground. The old survey that said, in a surveyor's cramped hand, that the near-loading chutes and the whole west row of pens stood on the Renfrow 40 and not 1 foot elsewhere. And then there was the water. The creek came down off the north slope and cut the corner of the 40 before it ran on toward town. Every steer that ever stood in a Cordell pen drank from it. Coburn had never bought that water. Nobody had. It sat there, the way the 40 had sat there, worthless looking, unclaimed. A thing too plain for a rich man to notice. Della filed on it under the plain borrowed name. She paid the county clerk his fee and watched him stamp the date, and she walked out with a water right in her coat that the whole yard depended on and did not know it had lost. That was the day she signed the deed outright, not the tax paper from before. The full deed, the 40 acres in fee, clean and recorded, with the right-of-way folded into it because the right-of-way ran across her ground and could be granted or withheld by whoever held the dirt. She sat at the clerk's counter and read every line twice before she put her name down. Her real hand under her plain name. And when it was done, the girl they had walked out of the yard owned the ground the yard stood on, the road the cattle crossed, and the water they drank. She did not feel triumphant. She felt very quiet. She felt the way her father looked the night he broke the last quarter of the 40, tired down to the boot, and satisfied in a way that had nothing to show for itself yet. It was not revenge. Not yet. It was only ground. But it was the ground under their boots, and they were still standing on it, and they did not know. Then the sky went to work on her side. The drought came in like a thing that had been promised and forgotten. Spring stayed dry. The grass came up thin and quit early. By July, the north slope was the color of an old saddle, and the creek, her creek, ran down to a thread a man could step across without wetting his heel. The cattlemen who had watched her walk the length of the yard 10 years back were watching the sky now, and the sky gave them nothing. You cannot hold cattle on grass that isn't there. So they had to ship. All of them. Early, before the market was ready, before the price was right, because a thin steer sold is money and a dead steer is a hole in the ground. The whole county turned toward the railhead the way a herd turns toward water, because there was only the one railhead, and it funneled every hoof in 40 miles down to the Cordell pens, down to her chutes, her gate, her ground. Coburn did not see it that way. Coburn saw a season he could corner. Della watched him do it from the freight office, from the same far end of the yard she had walked to, as a girl of 20, with the ledger against her chest. She had a clean window and a clean view, and 10 years of reading his hurry. He was overreaching, and he thought he was winning. He bought rail cars. Not owned, bought the use of them, on credit, against the season, more cars than any honest year would need. His notion was simple, and it was greedy, and it was the kind of thing that had always worked for him. Corner the cars. Every rancher panicked by the drought would have to ship, and the only cars to ship in would be Coburn's cars, at Coburn's rate, and he would take a cut off the top of every animal in the county before it ever left Kansas. He put his name to paper in the rail company's office in 3 counties. He leaned on his credit the way he leaned on everything. Without reading what held it up, Amos brought her the news the way he brought her everything now, slow, sitting, turning his hat. Amos Teague was 60 years old and had been a freight clerk longer than Della had been alive, and somewhere in the 10 years he had stopped being the old man who saw and said nothing and become the one man in the county who knew exactly what she was building. He had never asked her to trust him. She had watched him for 2 years first. Then one night she had set her father's ledger on the desk between them and opened it to the weigh-in page, and Amos had looked at it a long time, and then he had reached into his own coat and laid down his freight book and turned it to a page 10 years old, and there in the corner, underlined, was a number. 298. That's what came through the chute, Amos had said. I counted them myself. 300 your father drove in. 2 straight at the ford we found them after. 298 through the gate. True, the company wrote 244. He had tapped the number with one thick finger. 56 head your father never got paid for. 56 head short of the 300 he drove down, and that shortfall is most of what they hung the note on. I've kept it wrote down 10 years, girl. I kept it because a book ought to be honest even when the man holding it isn't. She had not cried then either. But it had been close. Now Amos turned his hat and told her Coburn had signed for the last of the cars. He's all in, Amos said. Every dollar of credit he's got, leaned against a season he figures he owns. And the lease under his pens comes due at the turn of the month. The dollar a season paper. He'll come renew it without reading it, same as he's done 20 years. Because why would this year be different? It won't be different, Della said. For him. For everybody else it will. Yes, she looked out the clean window at the pens filling up, at the dust standing in the dry heat over 1,000 thirsty cattle, at the near gate her father had forged with his own hands still hanging on its Coburn-painted post. Bring me the true tally, she said. The one you kept. And your book beside it. Not yet. When I tell you. On shipping day. In front of the men. Not before. Amos nodded slow. Been waiting 10 years to lay that book down in the open. I know, she said. So have I. Coburn came to renew the lease on a Thursday. He came the way he always came, big through the shoulders and easy in the walk. A man who had never once in his life wondered whether the ground would be there under his next step. He came to the yard cooperative office because that was where the lease was held now, the co-op having taken over the paper years back in a reshuffle he had not bothered to follow, because it changed his dollar a season not at all. He did not know who held the co-op now. He had never asked. The buyer behind the freight company had a plain name and paid on time, and a man like Coburn does not read the names under the things that serve him. He pushed open the office door with the lease renewal already folded in his hand, half signed, expecting a clerk. The name on the office door was Renfrow. He did not see it going in. He saw it later. First he saw her. She was behind the desk. She was 30 years old, and she had her father's plain, steady face and her hair in a dark twist, and she did not stand up when he came in. On the desk in front of her, square in the light from the window, lay an old cattle tally ledger, worn soft at the corners. Closed. Coburn stopped. Something in his easy walk hitched. He looked at her the way a man looks at a face he half knows from a long time ago, reaching for it, not finding it. "You'd be the freight woman," he said. "I've dealt with your company. Good enough." He put the folded lease on the desk. "I'm here to renew the pen's ground. $1 a season. Same as always. If you'll witness it, I'll be on my way. I've got a season to run." Della looked at the paper. She did not touch it. "There's no lease to renew, Mr. Coburn," she said. He smiled the way big men smile at small confusions. "It runs every year. It's run $20 a season on 40 acres of scrub. Your co-op holds it. I sign it. We're done." "The co-op doesn't hold it," Della said. "I hold it. Not the co-op. Me. The 40 acres your pens stand on belongs to me, in fee, recorded at the county. The right-of-way your rail spur crosses is mine to grant. The creek your cattle drink is filed to me. There is no $1 a season lease anymore, Mr. Coburn, because the man who signed that lease never owned what he was leasing to you, and the woman who owns it now hasn't leased you a thing." The office went very quiet. Outside, the pens murmured, 1,000 cattle and the dry wind. Coburn's smile stayed on his face a moment past when it should have. Then it came off, slow, like paint peeling. "That's Renfrow ground," he said. Not to her. To himself, reaching for the face again. "It is," Della said. "It always was. My father broke it. He patented it before your rail ever came. He signed a handshake for $1 a season, and he laughed at how little you paid, and he never once read to you the part where it was only ever his ground you were standing on." She turned the closed ledger a half-inch, so it sat square to him. "Ezra Renfrow's tally book, Mr. Coburn. You'll remember the name now." She watched it land. She watched it go into him the way the note had gone into her father on the platform 10 years back. All at once, the floor tilting under a man who had thought the floor was his. "Renfrow's girl," he said. His voice had gone thin. You've been. How long have you? 10 years. Della said. "I counted every one of them. I clerked your freight by lamplight. I bought a share. Then another. I bought the ground you leased and called it worthless. I bought the water. I bought the road. I did it a piece at a time, under a plain name, and you never once looked up from your own hurry to see who was buying the floor out from under you. You didn't check the paper under your pens, Mr. Coburn. You never do. My father told me that at supper, when I was a girl. A man ought to read what he leans on." Coburn put one hand flat on the desk. He was a big man, and he had gone gray in the face. "You'll lease it back to me," he said. "You have to. My pens are on it. My whole operation. The season's shipping, the county's got to move its cattle, I've got the cars." He caught himself. He heard how it sounded. A man listing what he stood to lose to the person who held the ground it stood on. "I don't have to do anything," Della said, still quiet. She had promised herself she would not raise her voice, and she did not. "But I'm not going to shut the pens. The county's got to ship, drought or no drought, and honest ranchers who never did my father a wrong shouldn't lose a season because you spent 20 years not reading your own lease. The pens will run. The chutes will run. Under new terms." He looked up. "Terms, every way in honest," she said. "A steer that walks through the chute gets counted as one steer, and the count that goes in the book is the count that walked through. Witnessed, in the open. No short counting. That practice ends today. In this yard, forever, the rates get published, on a board at the gate where every drover can read them. The same rate for every man. No cut for a friend, and no gouge for a stranger. And the freight moves through my company at the posted price. That's the terms. That's all of them. There's no $1 a season line and no favor in it. It's just an honest yard, run on my ground, at last. She had said she would name the terms in one dry sentence, and she had let it run to a few, because the yard had waited 10 years and deserved the whole of it plainly said. But she did not gloat. She did not smile. She named it the way her father read a tally, flat, true, done. Coburn stood there in the small office with the season he thought he owned turning to smoke in his hands. "You'll ruin me," he said. "No," Della said. "Your own book's going to do that." "Not me. I only bought the ground." "Come to the pens on shipping day, Mr. Coburn. Bring your cattle if you've got any left to bring. And bring your waybook from 10 years back. There's a page in it we're going to read out loud." He left without the folded lease. It stayed on the desk. She did not touch it. Shipping day came hot and bright and full of men. They came the way they had come 10 years before, 40 and more cattlemen, drovers, the rail agent, the whole county with its dust-colored herds, pressed up to the pens, because the drought gave them no other road. They came expecting Coburn's yard, and Coburn's rate, and Coburn's short count, because that was the yard they had always known. They found a board hung at the main gate, with the rates painted plain, one number for every man, and they stood in front of it reading it twice like men reading a thing in a foreign hand. And they found, standing on the loading platform where Thornton Coburn had always stood, a plain-faced woman of 30 with a cattle ledger under her arm. Word had gone around by then. It goes around a yard faster than fire. Renfrow's girl. The freight woman is Renfrow's girl. She owns the ground. She owns the water. The old dollar lease is dead, and Coburn came out of that office gray as ash. The men looked at her on the platform, and some of them remembered a girl of 20 walking the whole length of this same yard past their fathers' faces, and not one of them lifting a hand. And some of them had the grace to look at their boots. Thornton Coburn came too. He had to. His cattle had to ship like every other man's, and his rail cars, the cars he'd cornered the season with, bought on credit against a shipping he'd thought he'd own, sat on the siding needing to be filled or forfeited. He came up to the platform stiff and gray, and he brought, because she had told him to, and because some cold part of him needed to see it done, his waybook from 10 years back. Amos was already there. The old clerk stood at the weigh table with his own freight book, 60 years old and steady as a post, and when the first big lot of cattle had come through and been counted honest and written down in the open for every man to see, Della raised her hand and the yard went quiet, and she said, "Before we go on, there's an old account to close." Amos Teague opened his freight book to a page gone soft with 10 years, and he laid it on the weigh table in the sun. And then he took Coburn's waybook out of Coburn's own hand. Coburn let it go. He did not know why he let it go. But he let it go, and he laid that open beside it. 10 years back, Amos said, and his voice carried the way an old man's voice carries when he has waited a long time to use it. Ezra Renfrow drove 300 head down to this yard. I counted them through the chute myself. 2 straight at the ford, and were found after. 298 came through the gate, true and honest, and I wrote it down that day in this book. In this corner. Underlined, he put his thick finger on the number. 298. He moved his finger to the other book. To Coburn's book. And here's what the company wrote. 244. 56 head short of what the man drove down. 56 head Ezra Renfrow was never paid a cent for, wiped off with a pen. And it was that shortfall, that made-up shortfall, that put his account in the hole deep enough for the note to be called. 60 days, they gave him. $3,400, after the hardest winter any of us stood through. It couldn't be met, and it wasn't meant to be met. The count was rigged first. The note came after. The seizure came after that. It was a lie at the bottom, and I've had the true number wrote down in my own hand for 10 years, waiting for a yard honest enough to read it in. The cattleman looked at the 2 books lying open in the sun. 298 in the old clerk's hand. 244 in the company's. The gap between them was a man's whole ranch. It was a father dead within the year. It was a daughter who had walked the length of this yard and come back 10 years later owning the ground. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then a low sound went through the 40 men. Not a shout, worse than a shout. The sound of a county turning its face away from a man it had let get away with it. Thornton Coburn stood there with his way book open against him in the sun and had nothing to say. There was nothing to say. It was his own hand in his own book, and his own book had undone him. Not her word against his number against Amos's number, in the open for every man to read. The debt that took the Renfrow ranch stood exposed as the manufactured thing it was, and it had been manufactured by the man standing there, and everybody could see it. His word in the county collapsed in that silence. You could feel it go. And with it went the season he'd cornered. Because a man's railcar credit is only as good as his standing, and his standing was lying open on the weigh table, and the ranchers who'd have had to ship in his cornered cars now had a published rate and an honest yard, and a woman who held the ground. And they turned to her chutes and away from his cars, and the cars sat empty on the siding, drinking down his credit by the day. He had leaned his whole weight on a season, and the season had walked out from under him, the way she had once walked out from under his son's latched gate. She had said she would not do it by her own hand. She hadn't. He had built the debt. Amos had kept the truth. The county had turned. She had only owned the ground and named the terms and let his own book speak. Royce came 3 days later. He came alone, on a good horse, up to the office with the Renfrow name on the door, and he came for a shipping allotment. His father's cattle, what the Coburns still ran, had to move like everyone else's, and the cornered cars were gone, and the honest pens were the only pens, and so the son who had latched the gate came to ask the woman he'd latched it on for room at the chute. He had aged into a heavier version of himself. Still handsome, still certain in the shoulders, but there was something gone loose in his certainty now. A man who had spent the week watching his father's name burn. Della was at the desk. Her father's ledger was there, and her own beside it, open, both books in the light. Della, Royce said. Mr. Coburn, that stopped him a second. He tried a smile. It was the same smile from the spring 10 years gone, the smile that had ridden out to her father's place and courted her over the porch rail and sworn things it never meant to keep. I figured we could talk, he said. You and me. It doesn't have to be. All this. My father's a hard man, I know it. I never. He stopped. Started again. I need shipping. For the Coburn cattle. I came to ask you for an allotment. Della looked at him. She thought about the platform. She thought about the sound of her father's own forged gate latching shut behind her, and Royce's voice over the heads of 40 watching men. She had latched that memory shut herself a long time ago, and she found now, looking at him, that it held no heat anymore. Just a plain cold weight. You'll get an allotment, she said. Something eased in his face too fast, too grateful. You'll get the standard allotment, she went on, at the standard rate, the one painted on the board at the gate. The same room at the chute every drover in the county gets. Not one head more, not 1 cent less. Your cattle count honest through the chute like everybody's, and they ship at the posted price like everybody's. And that's all. That's the whole of what I've got for you, Mr. Coburn, he blinked. I'd thought, given what? He didn't finish it. He heard how it would sound, a Coburn asking a Renfrow for a favor at the chute. You stood on that platform the whole time, 10 years ago, Della said. Quiet. Not cruel. Just true. You'd courted me all that spring, and you swore to me you'd speak to your father, And when it came, you stood there, and you never said one word to him on my account, not one, and then you latched my own father's gate in my face in front of the county, and you said a Renfrow ships nothing through Cordell as long as you held the ground. She let that hang a beat. You don't hold the ground, Royce. You never really did. I do. And here's the thing I could have said back to you that day and didn't have the standing to. You ship through Renfrow ground now, at the Renfrow rate, honest, or you don't ship at all. Same as any man. That's not me shutting the gate on you. That's me holding it open exactly as wide as I hold it for everyone. Which is more than you ever did for me. She stood then, and she walked to the office door, and she opened it, and she held it. The door, not the gate. But he understood the shape of it, and she did not walk through it for him, and she did not slam it. She just held it open at the standard width, and waited. He went. There was nothing else in the room for him. He took the standard allotment at the posted rate, and he shipped his father's cattle honest through the chute her father forged, and he did not come to the office again. The county heard how he'd come, and how he'd left, because a yard hears everything. It did him no favors either. A man who latches a gate in a girl's face is one thing when his father holds the ground, and another thing altogether when the girl holds it, and hands him only what she hands the stranger beside him. Then the season ran, and it ran honest, and the drought broke in its own time. A year on, it was autumn again at Cordell Crossing. The slopes had greened back after the fall rains, and the creek, her creek, ran full and cold down off the north ground, and cut the corner of the 40 and went on watering the county's cattle the way it had watered them since before any rail ever came. The pens ran quiet and orderly in the gold light. Cattle moved through the chutes under honest weight, counted in the open, written down true, shipped at a rate any man could read off the board at the gate. 40 acres of ground that a map called worthless lay gold behind the loading chutes, and every head that shipped out of 40 miles of Kansas crossed it. Della sat on the office porch in the long dusk with a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow and 2 ledgers open on the little table beside her. Her father's, full and honest and closed, 10 years of a plain man's plain counting shut up in it forever. And her own, open, most of its pages filled now in her square hand, the 40 acres on the first line, and under it the water, and the road, and the shares, and a whole yard's worth of honest seasons written down true. Amos came out and set a second chair scraping on the boards, and lowered himself into it with the long, slow care of a man past 60. He was her partner now, plain on the paper and plainer in the running of it, the honest book he'd wanted to see win, once winning every day at the weigh table below. Cars all filled, he said. Last lots loaded. Clean count. Every one. Good. They sat a while. Below them the pens ticked and settled in the cooling air, and the wind came down off the green slope, smelling of water and cattle and dust laying down for the night. You heard about Coburn, Amos said. Not quite a question. I heard. Thornton Coburn had lost the rail company to the credit he'd leaned on and couldn't hold, and the men he'd owed had reshuffled it the way men do, and when the dust came down there was a freight desk in the company that now owned the pens on Renfrow ground, and a clerk's stool at it, and Thornton Coburn sat on that stool now and clerked freight for a wage. He counted other men's cattle onto other men's cars and wrote the numbers down honest because there was a woman above him who read what she leaned on. He was not ruined into the poorhouse. He was only made small and made to work an honest book at last on the ground he'd stolen for the blood he'd stolen it from. There was a justice in that shape that Della had not planned and did not need to improve. And Royce had gone west. Sold out his share of what was left and rode off toward country where the name Coburn still meant a big man and the name Renfrow meant nothing, looking for a floor that felt like his. Some men, when the ground turns out not to be theirs, cannot bear to stand on it a day longer. He was that kind. She did not wish him ill. She did not wish him anything. He was just gone. Your father'd have liked this, Amos said. The count coming out true. He wouldn't have liked the 10 years it took. No, Della said. He'd have said I was slow. A small thing moved at the corner of her mouth that was nearly a smile. But he'd have read the ground first, same as me. It's the only thing he ever really taught me. Read what you lean on. Coburn leaned on my father's 40 acres for 20 years and never once turned it over to see whose name was underneath. And what's took off a man's own ground, Amos said, never quite stays kept. No, she said. It doesn't. It finds its way back to the dirt it came off of. It just takes its time. The light went down gold and then rose-colored behind the loading chutes, and the 40 acres lay quiet under it. And a widowed drover who'd shipped through her yard all season and stayed talking at the gate longer than his business needed, came up the path below with his hat in his hand to ask, easy and unhurried, whether she'd walk the pens with him before the dark came all the way down. She'd tell him yes in a minute. There was time for that now. There was time for a great many quiet things now that the ground was hers and the books ran true. But first she sat a moment more with the 2 ledgers open in the last of the light, her father's closed and hers still going, and she watched the county's honest cattle move gold through the chutes on Renfrow ground. And she let the coffee go all the way cold, and she was, in the plain way her father had been the night he broke the last of the 40, satisfied. Then she closed her own book soft over the day's true count, and she went down the porch steps into the warm dusk to walk her own pens on her own ground, past every place that once had watched her walk the other way. Wherever you're watching from tonight, comment the name of your town. I'd like to know how far this story rode.